Welcome to the American Intelligence Media. My name is Douglas Gabriel, Thomas Paine, and I'm with Michael McKibben, and we are continuing our discussion today specifically focused on fake justice. Welcome to the show, Michael.
It's great to be here. Thanks.
You know more about fake justice because you've been beat up with it probably more than anybody I've ever met. 20 years of fake justice. But what we want to start off with is going back to where our previous conversation was. And that's something that you helped point out to me when we first met, and that's that the system of justice is rigged. It's partisan. You always know what the judge is going to determine before you go into court, and whoever assigns you to whatever judge determines the outcome of your case before your case is even tried in most instances. Now, what we point out here, the Anonymous Patriots, is that this fake system of justice is kind of like something that was handed down by the monarchical system of Europe, that if you're a Supreme Court justice, you might as well be a monarch. If you're a federal circuit court judge or appellate court judge, or you're some judge, you're a monarch. You get to act with absolute precociousness if you wish. You can cuss at people. You can scream at them. I've seen all this happen. I've been subject to it. I used to work in the courts. I've seen judges cuss people out. I've seen them scream it's their court and get out of their court and do things that were illegal inside their court. So when we are talking about this system, you have to be an esquire. You have to be a member of usually in America, when you're a lawyer, you become a member of a court. And these are the courts of England. And so the justice system comes from the courts of England.
You mean they're patterned
on
the
pattern.
Courts of England?
Exactly, the patterns. And so there's an American Inns of Court, and most attorneys belong to one or the other. But it's like a union, but it's also like a paramilitary organization of elitists.
It's a club.
It's a club, and they use the club on the rest of us.
Right.
So what I'm saying is you have to become an esquire. You become an esquire when you're a lawyer so that you can become, like in the British system, a landed gentry or a lord or somebody with some power so that you could actually speak before the court. But, of course, the courts and the people who rule them are like monarchs. And we, the people, the little people, oh, woe to the little person who wants to represent himself as his own lawyer in the court system. They usually take that out on you. So in America, our court system is fake justice. And recently, we got to see that with a Supreme Court decision that said that these lower court administrative judges really were not appointed and they can't be judges, but they are making massive decisions, huge amount of decisions, many, that affect all of our lives, and they are nobodies. They are simply political appointees who they knew when they appointed them what their decision would be on anything that came before them. So I'm saying it's fake.
This decision said that administrative patent judges had the right to take away somebody's patent property. Even though Justice Marshall 100 years ago said that a patent once issued was a contract between the state and the patent holder and could not be taken away. Even though that law's on the books, this Supreme Court law completely contradicts that.
Well, Michael McKibben, no one would know better than you. Every time I mention something about the court, because of my ignorance, you usually, refine it to make sure that I get this right because you like to be very exact, because you have been subject to one instance of fake justice after the next for the last 20 years, and you've spent millions of dollars trying to defend the fact that you're just an inventor that had the great invention of our time, and it was stolen from you, and the justice system has fought you tooth and fang the entire way, and you even found out that many of those justices fought you because they had stock in Facebook, the very company that you were suing.
Facebook interests, I call it, because it's much more sophisticated than that. These guys weren't stupid enough to have stock in actual Facebook. What they had was stock in all of the investors in Facebook, including their top mutual fund investor, Fidelity Contra Fund. But if you start looking at their holdings, it's clear that these judges specifically were rewarded with inside knowledge of which mutual funds were going to be heavily invested in the Facebook IPO, and they were all invested in all those funds. And that was our first clue of this fake justice you're talking about. And what we have come to see from additional experience is absolutely 100% true, that the chief judges in these courts decide which judges take a case when it comes before them. And it's clear from even some of the recent resignations of the chief judge for the Federal Circuit, Randall Rader, was caught basically trading inside knowledge with one of the large law firms that would come before him regularly. And they even called themselves BBFs, Best Friends Forever. And he got caught. He had to resign. But tellingly, he was even given an award after that for the Patent Hall of Fame. So clearly these attorneys and their judges are all in this mess. And justice may come occasionally, in my observation, when you got two large companies fighting with each other. Then sometimes the decisions actually make sense. But whenever it's a small guy or an inventor like me coming up against the military-industrial complex, which it wasn't Facebook, it was the entire intelligence community, the decisions are a foregone conclusion. They just go through the motions. We spent a total of $10 million on that effort, and so they'll let you go through the motions and pretend to be following the law, but they're not following the law, and they already know how they're going to decide.
So these judges are either brilliant stock market analysts.
Oh yeah,
they have a lot
geniuses.
of luck.
They're geniuses.
They're genius. That must be it. They're all stock market geniuses. That's why when you look at their assets, they have a lot more money than they made as a judge.
Right.
And then they say, well, I made it from stocks. Well, isn't that dandy? Well, let's look at our good buddy John Podesta and the fact that he broke the Federal Election Commission's laws, not only through rigging the primaries, through stealing $84 million from the states and funneling it into Hillary, not only those kind of things, but in every way you see that John Podesta should go to jail. Well, who is then found out to be the person that he's shuffling the money through? Well, Eric Elias through Perkins Coie through Fusion GPS. So it goes to court. So there's now multiple court cases concerning Fusion GPS and Christopher Steele. Christopher Steele's being sued by Russians, the Russian bankers, as well as Alexei Gubarev. And so it comes before a judge. And then we find out that Fusion GPS, the $12 million went to them. And so the judge says, I want to see the records. And Fusion GPS says, I'm not going to show you our bank records. And so what do? They change judges. Middle of the stream. And who do they appoint? Judge Leon, John Podesta's close buddy. As a matter of fact, in his confirmation hearings, he said, I will not give up my class that I teach at Georgetown with John Podesta if it means, don't appoint me if it means I have to give up my class with my bunk buddy, John Podesta, who now he has John Podesta before him in this case and he's not recusing himself. That's fake justice.
You know, the person who's supposed to monitor it at that level is Chief Justice John Roberts. But I don't see him lifting a finger on any of these conflicts of interest. The Supreme Court is totally corrupt when it comes to disciplining the lower judges.
How about Imran Awan case? Largest espionage case. Inspector General says there's 13 crimes, gives them all the evidence. It goes before a judge. And then all of a sudden, another judge is appointed. That judge is kicked out. And Tanya Chutkan is appointed. And what does she do? Well, we told you from the beginning, she's a Obama appointee. She's going to let him off scot-free, and basically that's what's happening. Or how about Judge Contreras, who was chosen to impanel a grand jury against Paul Manafort, and the number one witness was Peter Strzok, his friend. Oh, Peter Strzok.
Isn't that magical?
And then, wait, once Peter Strzok testifies as the key witness in a grand jury indictment, which you don't get to question him yourself with your lawyer if you're the subject of that grand jury indictment, by the way. He's the star witness. We know that he didn't even have a security clearance at that moment. It had been revoked. And that he had already led all these other corrupt things. I won't get into all of that. But right there before Judge Contreras, he listens to the testimony about Michael Flynn, And then they pass judgment on Michael Flynn and gets a plea deal. And then Judge Contreras, at that point, steps down and recuses himself. Recuses himself after he makes his judgment, because it's found out that Peter Strzok is his good friend and they have dinner together and that he was being manipulated by Strzok and Page, and it's all in the text messages. Nothing goes on. This is fake justice. Now let's talk about the new Supreme Court justice. But before we do, let's mention the fake justice that's going on in a lawsuit, a fake lawsuit, by a fraudulent person who's done this many times before, spent 18, 19 months in jail for fraud. Him and another person who defrauded even a veteran who died to get his money from a GoFundMe account. These two fraudulent people get three other people to go back in their memories 28 to 35 years to say that they were molested by a doctor in a wrestling team in Ohio, and that a 21-year-old coach was aware of this because they talked about it in the shower room. And because of that, then he had knowledge of that, though there was never a single case ever brought, no reports ever made, no documentation of such. And at least two of the five people are completely fraudulent. We're talking about, of course, Jim Jordan. Now, the amazing thing is Michael McKibben ends up everywhere where there's something going on. Michael, you got input into this one?
Well, I heard some of the story, and they're talking about the locker room talk, and specifically back then, the athletic facilities were much smaller than they are now at Ohio State, and that was in Larkins Hall. Now, the wrestling team's not a large team, neither is the fencing team or the gymnastics team, so they were all in the same building, and it was a common locker room. And I've actually been in that locker room, and I don't even remember whether I've showered or not, but I used to have a class, a weightlifting class in that building. And so it was a common facility that everyone in the university used, including the teams. So the idea that there was this little private area where only wrestlers were taking showers, and that's where all this alleged nefarious activity took place, that Jim Jordan, as a 21-year-old, just out of school, overheard and failed to report, is just ludicrous. Because Larkins Hall was a public facility. It was not a private facility.
Well, let's look then at not the fake justice. Let's look at what's really going on with Jim Jordan. As we all know, Jim Jordan is one of the candidates that could replace the Speaker of the House, Republican in name only, Paul Ryan, who is just an awful person and needs to get out of politics because he can't open his mouth without lying. Now, and we should have known that because he did, look who he ran alongside of when he was a vice presidential choice, okay? Who's more corrupt?
Mitt Romney, right?
Yeah, who's more corrupt than that? I mean, really, you're not going to get any more corrupt than Paul Ryan. So Jim Jordan is fighting the good fight. He's one of the 5 or 6 out there with Devin Nunes and others. So he's fighting the good fight. He's getting somewhere, and he's not letting up. I always like the fact that he has his jacket off because he's like ready to wrestle. He's ready to rumble. He's ready to wrestle.
He was good. I think alligators. He was twice an NCAA champion.
And his whole family. And
the guy's a fighter.
And his nephew just died in a car wreck, which is very, very, very suspicious, by the way. So he comes out. He is basically saying, okay, we're going to now impeach Rod Rosenstein. And Rod Rosenstein, who he called out in that congressional testimony, he basically called him a liar to his face over and over and over again. And Rod looked like an idiot and couldn't give any proper answers.
Well, he responded in an arrogant, combative way. So much for being a civil servant.
And the minute, and what happened was, see, Jim Jordan wants to see those FISA warrants, and he wants to see the evidence that got those FISA warrants, and Rod Rosenstein signed them. So he was chewing him out saying, not only have you redacted pertinent information that you gave to us, you removed it. You removed it, and you won't show us what we want to see. And then what does Rod Rosenstein say? Well, when I signed that, I didn't read it. I have a team that prepares those things for me, and when people redact things, I don't redact them.
He's admitting incompetence as a leader.
Correct.
If he's not willing to take responsibility for those that are employed by him. It's just absolutely ludicrous what he. I don't get why most people don't just write that guy off when he can claim that he doesn't know what his subordinates are doing, and then he can act arrogant when somebody calls him on the carpet for it.
That's what we saw.
And where I come from, he'd have been fired in a minute.
Exactly. I would impeach him right there for his lies right before the committee. I am not in charge of my team. My team makes the mistakes. I'm in charge, but don't blame me for my team.
Oh my gosh.
That's insane. And that's what he said.
Right.
And he clearly said that he signed that FISA warrant request without reading the content, and that the content that Jim Jordan had brought from the released and unredacted documents that they had, Rod Rosenstein said, well, that's not what happened. That's not what I was told.
Look,
that's not what I signed.
We all know that the FISA court is a joke, that it's a rubber stamp for the deep state, for the SES. We know that. So why are we pretending that's not the case? Why are we continuing to think the FISA court is anything but a tool of the SES to perpetuate this agenda they have?
Yes, and I'll underscore that by what I often repeat. In 2016 of December, the IG report on the FISA court said that it was in 100% noncompliance, both internationally and specifically domestically, and specifically said James Comey had never once filed a single FISA court warrant for any domestic surveillance. Now, mind you, I'm going to repeat that. He didn't file this is what the report said. Read it yourself. I've read it. It says he did not file any, not one. That means he lied to the court about the filing for Carter Page's Title I 702 request, which said to get that, he would have had to have said that he had 100% proof, evidence that Carter Page was a spy. That's the only way you can get that. The Inspector General said he didn't do that. He never did that. And under testimony, he said he never signed for those.
The facts are clear.
And he never unmasked people.
The facts are clear. He's acting criminally. What's the next step? As I understand it, the next step is that the Attorney General is supposed to step in and indict him. Why isn't that happening? And if it's not happening, then what we're really saying is we don't have a rule of law in this country.
You know why. You know more about Michael Horowitz than anybody. Why is Michael Horowitz a fraud? Because the entire Inspector General...
No, he's groomed. He's been groomed his whole career to do what he's doing right now. It's really evident from his history. He was the one coaching everyone on how to avoid sentences for a decade, giving seminars.
Exactly.
Continuing ed seminars to lawyers and judges all over the country.
Keeping the corporations aware of how to get out of sentencing and telling the judges how to go easy on corporations with sentencing. Right. And he's got a long record of it. Truth, the Inspector General office is where truth goes to die. He didn't indict anybody, even though he had Huber as a Department of Justice attorney who could have indicted anybody with the evidence that was presented. There was plenty of evidence. No, there's no conclusions, no evidence, probably will never be. The the Inspector General report on the FISA, it was so bad that they said they weren't going to renew it unless there was a correction made. And so there was another judge appointed to look over the corrections. So they had months to make the corrections. They said they corrected them. Then Donald Trump said, don't worry about the FISA court. Dan Coates and I are working out a way that Americans will no longer be surveilled in the future. And the FISA court problems will be solved. Why are they going to be solved? Because they're going to release the FISA court warrant information that shows all the people, there's 8 of them, all have to go to jail. They lied to the FISA court, and they conducted a coup d'etat against a sitting president. That's what the Mueller investigation is. That's what Crossfire Hurricane was. That's what the committee to impeach was. That's what the interagency committee was. There were 12, 13 different names for this group. It's now the Mueller investigation. It's the same people who came out of the DOJ, who led the DOJ, FBI, State Department, CIA attack against Trump during the election. They went over and they moved to this Mueller team along with the evil lawyers that he brought out of WilmerHale and other places. That's fake justice.
I could tell you there's two words that created this situation where we don't have the rule of law. It's called judicial discretion. It's a term that's emerged out of all the case law, which basically says that a judge can't be held liable for even a criminal act because that judge has judicial discretion over interpretation of the law. And that is the concept that has destroyed our rule of law in our republic, in my opinion.
We just saw that with the Supreme Court's decision. Now, you can explain this much better than I, but these minor courts make rules upon Trump's...
You're talking about administrative courts, not minor courts, right? Or
No,
are you talking about district courts?
I'm using the wrong term. You correct me, you fill in the right term. When Trump said people from these 7 countries can't come in, I'm the president, the Constitution allows me to do this, I'm protecting you, some stupid judge in some court said no, and so held it up. And then it got through that. And then another judge
went to appeal, and then the appeals court supported it, right?
And then it went back and forth. Then it went to the Supreme Court. And then the Supreme Court said, well, of course he can make these rules. It's in the Constitution. Can you read?
Right.
5-4 was the judgment. The 4 who ruled against it ruled against the Constitution and should be taken out to Gitmo as treasonous fake justice.
Well, it's their
people.
Discretion to be able to.
There's no
rule
such
again.
thing.
Judicial discretion,
Yeah,
Douglas.
judicial
you
discretion.
need to repeat that over and over again in the mirror until
Fake
you get it.
Justice. Fake justice. Judicial
Judicial
discretion.
discretion.
Yes, they sound exactly alike.
There you go.
So what happens is they turn around and the Supreme Court says, we ruled on this, and of course he can make this judgment. Of course that's his job. And you're stupid. It's right here in the Constitution. And then what happens after that? They then say in the written judgment, it says, let me just paraphrase in a Thomas Paine way, Paine in the ass of the globalists. Basically, they said, you stupid lower court judges.
Ninth Circuit, he's referring.
You are not a monarch. We are going to take away your discretion in these issues because you have used it incorrectly, and we are going to censure and sanction you, if not impeach you, if you send us another stupid case like this.
See, here's the problem, though. That's a case that went all to the Supreme Court. But the fact is, the Supreme Court hears very few cases of injustice where people have been mistreated in the lower courts with this idea of judicial discretion. These lower courts know that very few of their cases ever make it to a Supreme Court hearing. In this case, it was one that Donald Trump pushed. Obviously, he got attention. But for most of the rest of us, our cases get killed at the district court level where the judge has done exactly the same thing, and you've gone through millions and millions of dollars to get a case thrown out by a crooked judge, and then you have to appeal it to a 3-judge panel where that particular chief judge can pick the crony judges to continue to support that lower judicial discretion farce. And then if you want to then go to the Supreme Court, you've got to file what's called a writ of certiorari and then hope, cross your fingers that they might even think about it. But here's the problem, even with the Supreme Court. Do you think those judges look at all those cases that come before the Supreme Court? The answer is no. Who looks at it are the clerks that work for those judges. So they call through all of these, and inevitably those clerks are tied in with some large law firm that is feeding these judges on the back end. So it is a circular feeding system so that most of the justice never occurs. And the few cases that get out, like the one you just mentioned, show a little justice. But probably percentage-wise, 99.5% of the time, judicial discretion wins the day, and the rule of law is thwarted.
And in my opinion, in the opinion of the Anonymous Patriots and the Conclave, basically our judicial system is a place where justice goes to die. Because really what it is it's a system where corporations are given more rights than people. And these are decisions made by courts that allowed corporations to have more rights than humans. Corporations can kill people and no one goes to jail. Corporations can steal. They can do every crime imaginable, and mostly they get a fine, a cost of doing business fine, and then they get away with absolute murder, literally. But we, the people, we don't get away with that. And so what we see is a very imbalanced system where judges are like monarchs, lawyers are like esquires and landed gentry, corporations are like barons and people of high rank, and we, the people, are the last ones to ever be considered. We even have to have someone represent us even to go before one of these monarchical judges who then basically rule with absolute caprice.
Can I add to that the idea that there is a possibility you can represent yourself? It's called pro se self-representation. So to be totally accurate, you are able, if you want to represent yourself. Now, if you're a corporation, you can't do that. You have to hire an attorney if a corporation is being sued. But you can go as an individual. The problem is all the rules of civil procedure apply to you. So you have to know the entire insider, old boy mill of judicial procedure, court procedure, in order to get through these cases. So that's why self-representation is largely a joke.
Well, you've done that, and you've suffered through that, and you've seen other people who've done that. Have any of them ever won their cases?
Well, I'll let you know soon.
We hope you'll be one of the first, right? Yeah! And you have cleverly worked out a way that the president can just simply pay you for the work you've done, and then that will cause all kinds of things to come unraveled. The last thing that I want to focus on is the following. Why do federal courts have precedent over state courts? When federal courts were set up, it was a game. It was a game to see who could set up a federal court in their state, so that then when they went before that, because there were only a few federal courts in the beginning, and I say that federal courts should only exist within the District of Columbia and only handle cases that have direct impact upon the federal government, which should only be a very, 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 very limited amount of things. Okay? And I say that if there's an IRS problem in a state, the state can deal with it. If there's most of the federal issues are not federal issues. And to think that they have superiority, the federal government really has no authority whatsoever that we don't give them, period. So to think that they have authority over us and they've given more rights to corporations and to esquires and to the elite and to judges than they give to we the people? No. Is there something wrong with closing down all federal courts, Michael?
I don't think so. I think that the reason it's beneficial for these attorneys to have federal courts is because many times the litigants are on the other side of the country. And so when they have these what they call multi-jurisdictional legal issues where, somebody from one state sues somebody from another state, so they have a confusion over where to file it, then that's why they go to federal. But then you go to federal appeals, that's even farther away from you. So who benefits when a case is heard on the other side of the country? The system benefits because these guys can cook the books and they're not accountable to the local people. And I think that's why they like it, because everything's arm's length, at a distance. Supposedly that's supposed to give you justice. But what we have seen is all that does is allow these guys to feather their own nests with each other and the law firms that are involved in these cases. So it's the judges and the law firms and the clerks who then talk to the bankers, who give them tips about which investments to make, as long as they give them favorable rulings. And you've got a very closed cronyistic system. It's not justice.
Well, let's talk about the fake justice system called grand juries and the fake justice system called the Inspector General. First off, there's only 2 nations in the world that still allow grand juries. They should just be criminal. They are the leftover British Star Chamber, which they would create the Star Chamber when they had royalty that had committed a crime, and the Star Chamber was there to make sure the crime went away. That's all it was.
Yeah.
Now, what happens now? It is always political. When they impanel a grand jury, they know by the judges they impanel it with what the outcome is going to be. The person they're charging never even gets to see the witnesses or speak to the witnesses, and their lawyers don't necessarily get to speak to the witnesses. And in most grand jury impaneling and indictments, there's one star witness who is fake, usually. They testify and then they leave, and they don't come back, and no one ever gets to question them, and they usually don't even present evidence. And then when you get there, if you're being charged, they're supposed to only go after you if there's a crime they're trying to decide, not they go after you to find the crime. And that's what they've done with Donald Trump. But they go after you for a crime. So you come into the grand jury indictment and before the impaneled grand jury, and you answer their questions. And it's always a trick. Everyone knows this. They're going to ask you questions that you've already been asked before. And they ask you questions on one day and on the second and the third. And by the third day, you say something different. They catch you. They say that you lied to them. They charge you with 5 years for lying to them. And then you do a plea deal and whatever. This is what always happens. But you're always guilty. You're never going to get away from it. You can't even have your lawyer there when they question you. You have to go out into the hall to ask your lawyer a question. Then you can come back in and answer them. And they're going to trip you up by asking you so many questions that at some point you are going to falter. That's why Donald Trump should not ever go before the special counsel with Mueller, because that's what they got Paul Manafort for, Rick Gates. They got Michael Flynn, Carter Papadopoulos. All for what? Because they had
Carter Page.
They had surveillance on them. And then they ask them a question without telling them they had surveillance. And then when they give a different answer than what was on the surveillance, bingo, they got them. And then they try to manipulate them and say, okay, now if you will turn state's evidence and turn against the person we want and help us invent a crime, we're going to go lenient on you. This is standard operating procedure.
Isn't that what they're trying to do with Roger Stone right now?
Exactly.
They're trying to. They've illegally gathered all this information, and they're going to keep asking him questions until somebody trips up. I mean, Roger just had the previous case that was filed against him and President Trump thrown out. This is classical lawfare. And by the way, lawfare was created by the old KGB disinformation department in the Soviet Union. They're the ones that figured out that they could use the Western system of justice to collapse our country by this kind of activity. It seems to be working. KGB's gone, but the American versions of the KGB, called the SES, in my opinion, are the ones who have picked up on it, and they're chasing it like crazy. I mean, look, Roger and the president were sued on totally bogus defamation claims, and they've spent over a year, and last thing I heard is Roger's bill was like $200,000 to defend himself against a totally bogus, unmerited charge against him. The system itself is punishing good people. The system itself. And I noticed this when I have had people sue me for totally made up charges. All of a sudden, this system, so let's presume for instance, you got one guy that's innocent and the other guy's totally guilty. The guilty guy files a case against you for made up claims. What does the system do? The system then takes the claims of that person that are totally made up and moves them up to a 50% level, assuming he might be guilty, he might be innocent. Okay, then it drops the person who's totally innocent down from 100% down to 50%. And then the whole system moves forward on the basis that one or the other is lying and we have to figure out which one. So the bottom line is the unscrupulous individual who files a case creates a moneymaker every time they file a lawsuit, because many times those will have to be settled in order to stop the madness. And so the person who's the victim has to then pay money to the bad guy. It's a money-making business, our legal system.
That's beautiful. That's the redistribution of justice
Yes.
by wealth.
Yep.
That's disgusting.
Yep.
I never saw that it's socialism. It's fascism. It's fascism and justice. Well, we see that with the fact that Mueller knows for a fact that his job was to bankrupt Paul Manafort, bankrupt Rick Gates, bankrupt Michael Flynn, bankrupt Carter Page.
He pulled them
Sam
down
Clovis,
to 50%.
and a dozen others that he has questioned and ripped to pieces. He is bankrupted. That's why Trump says these 13 angry Democrats have ruined the lives of many people. Yes, they do this on purpose.
Yep.
This would be
It's a money
weaponized
maker.
justice.
Yes.
And the grand jury is the worst place for it because it shouldn't even exist. The grand jury is anything but justice. It is the opposite of justice. Now, let's go towards the instrument that they use to create grand juries in most cases, or in many, many cases, and that is the Janet Reno rewritten law that made the Inspector General a regulation that is unregulated.
Right. I cannot believe why the Congress has not shut down this, quote, Inspector General, which is only an administrative procedure at this point within the Justice Department. It ceased to be a law in 1999. There is no grand jury or Inspector General law on the books right now, and yet we've empowered Mueller to act as if there is a law, when in fact he's only an administrative procedure within the Justice Department.
Oh,
How screwed up is that?
special counsel. A
Special
special
counsel.
Sorry,
Right.
I said it wrong.
You're
Sorry,
right.
I messed up
Special.
everybody. If I said Inspector General, we're talking about the special counsel, or what, there's 10 names for it, but the special counsel is also special investigator,
That's the law
independent counsel.
that expired in 1999, right?
Independent. None of those exist. So what we're talking about, administrative judges really is what these are. They're just people who are appointed to do the dirty work of one particular party or the other. That's all Mueller is.
The special counsel provision within the Department of Justice that is the authorization for the Mueller investigation is an administrative procedure within the Department of Justice. It is not a law. Congress should shut it down tomorrow.
And every member of the special counsel, unless they are already civil servants or SES members, become senior executive service members who, without even getting approval, can spend $100 million on each special counsel investigation per year.
Right.
That's what Janet Reno built into the system so that they would have infinite money to go after any political individual they want and weaponize justice
So I have a
against
question
them.
for you. With that being the case and it being so clear from the paperwork, why is this continuing?
Because Trump
There's
used
no
to,
authority for it.
correct. Trump used to say that the people in Washington were stupid. And they're stupid to the stupid power. What is going on here, anyone can see through this. First off, let's take the special counsel's charges. Conspiracy against the United States of America. There is no such charge. Collusion with Russia. There can't be such a charge because the Russians would never agree to cooperate to demonstrate the collusion. And so you could never defend yourself. That's like defending yourself against the phrase,
Well,
are you still beating your wife? You can't.
We know that the charges are bogus, but this goes back to my example. By accusing him of something he didn't do, it drops an innocent man's 100% innocence down to 50%. The false accusations go from zero credibility to 50%, and then they chase this ghost forever.
That's exactly what they intended to do. And Mueller's buddy, Comey, started from the beginning to say, how can we smear Trump so that we can move him from 100% down to 50% where everybody says, well, maybe he's a liar because
Right.
the Russian dossier said he was having sex with whores. It says he's being paid by Russian banks to the Trump Tower. It says that he has been in Putin's pocket
Right.
for 5 years. It says that Michael Cohen is receiving money in Prague. It says that the DNC was hacked by Alexei Gubarev.
They never have to prove any of that. All they have to do is get it up to 50%, and they've achieved their objective.
And that's called the October surprise, so you lose the November election.
Right.
But when it went beyond that, because remember the Carter Page FISA warrant didn't get approved until October. Late October, they wouldn't need it if it was only until the election.
Well,
it was
we've-
called the
we-
insurance package.
We've got enough evidence from the stroked page email or text messages that these guys are guilty of sin. Why are we continuing this conversation? Why do we have to keep repeating over and over this evidence?
Because there are 117,000 members of the Department of Justice, and there is no justice there. It is fake justice.
Okay, let's fire them.
I say fire them all. But now Mike Mulvaney is doing that right now. And he's tearing apart And they just hired this other woman. I was reading about it today. And she is going through and combining and realigning everything. We will have a new federal government by the time Trump takes his second 4-year term. And when that happens and it's new, and you get rid of most of the federal government, and you get rid of the senior executive service members altogether, because they're basically, as you say, the KGB in America, or worse, they're more like...
I think they're more sophisticated than...
Correct.
KGB was pretty sophisticated, but this is a whole new level of corruption.
What's the highest British one? MI5 and 6 together, merged together with the Privy Council, merged together with all the evil that we've been talking about. That's what they are. Now, who are those people? They're the ones who keep everybody convinced that the special counsel is a law.
Right.
That their members aren't senior executive service members.
It's not a law. It's an administrative procedure within the Justice Department. Shut it down.
Now, let's look at the third charge, which has now arisen against Trump. First off, the collusion never happened. They tried to frame anyone they could in the Trump team with the Brits and with all kinds of people, not just the Brits. But they tried to frame everybody. They couldn't. So, essentially, Trump knows this is going on. And when these people lie and say that it's legal, that it's whatever, that these are true charges, it's nothing but a smear campaign to try to smear him during the election, and now it's a coup d'etat.
MK Ultra propaganda. That's
absolutely
following orders.
It's Tavistock. It's the Frankfurt School. It's now the Eric Schmidt U.S. Digital Service. It's now the George Soros Atlantic Council group that is the Truth Ministry.
It's
Facebook.
It's the Truth. What do they call them?
Yeah, the fact finders. And
the
all
fact
these people.
finders. Yeah.
No, it's that's all nonsense. What's really going on, folks, is these things are collapsing. And when Trump reduces it, there's 4.5 million people working for Trump, to the executive branch. He can get rid of 2 million of them are, in fact, soldiers and the National Guard. The rest of them, for instance, when 36,000 of them quit within the first months of Trump coming to power, nobody missed them.
Well,
no job was left undone.
Here's what we need to do. We need to move all the federal agencies out of Washington and put their offices across the country.
That would be beautiful.
It would be much less expensive for the people, for the administrative procedures themselves. It would take away Washington's power, because part of the power is they're all together and concentrated in one place, so it's easier to be corrupt. So we would separate. We would do what the founders always intended for keeping Washington and New York separate. You would separate them because you can't trust consolidated power. So let's deconsolidate it.
Absolutely. Now let's think this through. The IRS is illegal, always has been. It's nothing more than assigning war debt. We don't need the IRS. You pay a tax when you buy something. Then the rich will have to pay taxes. And the poor, they don't buy much. They won't have to pay that many taxes. And it'll be less taxes. No, Social Security can still be taken out and provided for, as well as Medicare, Medicaid, from that same tax. IRS, gone, not there. Okay, good. No more federal courts, period. Maybe a couple, maybe one in D.C. if there was an issue about a law that the president was creating a treaty or something where it actually really was something to do with the District of Columbia. Other than that, forget about it. IRS is what the big deal is. Okay, FBI, the FBI should not have any power, and they don't, by the way, in any county in America. The FBI must ask the permission of the sheriff before they can even be active in any county in America. So they don't have authority, and that's the way the law is. Do we need them on the borders? Turn your National Guard into securing the borders. Do we need such a big military? No, we don't. Pull them back from the 164 military bases. Stop protecting corporate interests. And by the way, change the Supreme Court ruling about corporations having more powers than humans. Make them as culpable for the same crimes that a human is. We get rid of the stock market.
Everybody would flee the boards of directors then.
We can get rid of all. We can dissolve all these problems so simply. As you say, election problems, no problem. Go to paper and then ink your thumb. Done.
Right.
We just need to use common sense. You can't name a reason for a federal court. You can't name a reason for IRS, for Internal Revenue Service taking your money from you before you get it for some imaginary debt that you were ascribed at the moment that you got a birth certificate and you got a Social Security number. Now you have part of the U.S. federal debt. that's owed to the U.S. Federal Reserve, which is not U.S., it's not federal, and it's not a reserve. It is nothing more than a British way to rip us off and keep us in basically debt for the fiat currency that they provided. Can Trump take care of all of that? Absolutely. He's already made the list of these very things we're talking about, and he's fighting it tooth and fang. So when we see the manipulation of Congress to try to go against our hero, Jim Jordan from Ohio, that needs to be the next Speaker of the House because of some fake justice, when we see fake justice in the special counsel of Mueller now even inventing the concept of obstruction of justice between a president and the head of the FBI, that's so stupid. That's like saying that a boss can't fire an underling. That's stupid. There's no obstruction of justice. He fired him because he had committed crimes in front of all of America. He had lied. He had perjured himself. He had not done an investigation. And now that we know that he didn't do an investigation, Hillary wasn't even mentioned. There was no investigation against Hillary and her emails. It was simply a matter that even the 302s that were written up afterwards were fake and changed. And Comey's statement, all fake.
We know
fake
they're all
justice.
Criminals. The question is, who's going to hold them accountable? And it seems to me we're down to our president bringing in some other form of judicial fairness, probably a military tribunal, to get this done. But maybe I could close this with my observation on Jim Jordan. One of the things that's obvious with these MK Ultra mind control memes is that one of the things they do when they make up a sexual story is they have not just one person come forward, but 4 or 5 at a time. And look what they've done. With all of a sudden, you got all these wrestlers that 30 years ago that knew for sure Jim Jordan knew something as a 21-year-old kid, hardly out of college himself. And so it seems to me whenever we hear that story in the future, that should be the trigger for everybody in America to just ignore the story from that point on, because it can't be true.
And when you see the deep state and the shadow government go after somebody like him, you can be assured that it's fake justice. And there are ways, military tribunals for treason. President Trump could call together all of the governors and the attorney generals, and they could sue the federal government because of their lack of doing their job. Trump could take that advice or even their recommendations and trim it so that there's hardly anything left. We got to get rid of the 500 lawyers who control the senior executive service members out of the Department of Justice. We have to get, and by the way, on the list, there should be no more corporate intelligence. Here's the deal. Trump should simply say these things we were saying. No federal courts, no IRS, no Federal Reserve.
Move Washington agencies out of Washington.
Tax the stock market. Do not allow mortgages to be controlled by a centralized system, and don't allow anything to be controlled by centralized systems, especially elections. Use paper and ink your finger. Then he needs to put sharpshooters on the top of all the Capitol buildings, and if they see a lobbyist step anywhere in D.C., they shoot them. An open season on lobbyists.
I know you're just joking.
No, I'm not. I say open season on lobbyists. Trump said that he was going to pass this law that you can't be a lobbyist once you've held certain positions. Secondly, you cannot go into corporate intelligence once you've been in military intelligence. Period. Immediately, that should be a felony. You should not be able to go out of the SEC and go into being a lawyer in a hedge fund or managing a hedge fund. You shouldn't be able to go out of cyber warfare in the military and go into cyber warfare in the corporate world and use it against America. There should be no opposition research groups like Fusion GPS, like the Podesta brothers. No, wrong. Why would you allow a propaganda machine to manipulate people? We have to get rid of
an admitted propaganda machine.
Exactly. And Obama started that with the National Defense Authorization Act, starting up the Global Engagement Center, and he started propagandizing us years and years ago. And now it's common. It's such a common standard that they get upset when they get caught. And not only do they get upset, then they say, no, we don't do it. And then they say, yes, we absolutely do it 100%. And we're proud of it. We sent in, those weren't spies we sent into the Trump. Those were Trump team. That was informers. And let's close this out with you giving a picture of James Chandler, one of the most corrupt globalist weaponized lawyers in America who has stolen more patents than probably anybody else and has literally written laws that allow lawyers and judges to legally lie, fake justice. Can you tell us about how he created that little law?
Yes, in 1996, he was the big man on campus with the Economic Espionage Act, the Federal Trade Secrets Act, dealing with counterfeiting, with spying. He was advising Congress, advising the courts, advising commercial enterprises. And the big focus of his effort was the Economic Espionage Act, which was passed on October 10th of 1996, and the Federal Trade Secrets Act. Well, there was another act passed that day, which is passed over, and nobody talks about it. It was called the, wait, I got to think of the name of it again. The False Statements Accountability Act was passed the very same day. And that's a law that had been on the books for, I think, like since the 1930s. And it basically said what you'd expect, that when you come before a tribunal, a government tribunal, whether it be a court or Congress, you cannot lie. That's what the law says in subsection 1. It says you can't lie, don't lie to a court, don't lie to the Congress, don't lie to administrative judges. Subsection 2 then was added. And subsection 2 said that for lawyers, for litigants, for people testifying to Congress, subsection 1 doesn't apply.
Legal lying.
So nobody reads subsection 2 because subsection 1 made so much sense. They think, okay, fine, that's what this says. But in fact, the law that has the name False Statements Accountability Act is the very law that justifies all the lying to Congress. None of these guys can go to prison because Congress passed that law. One of them was my governor. Governor Kasich was a congressman then. He was one of the guys that approved that law. But do you hear anybody talking about that law? They all know they're allowed to lie and they'll get away with it. That's ridiculous. It's outrageous.
Well, Michael, I think we call that fake justice.